Hi folks, wherever you're joining us from, whatever time it is, right now for you, I invite you to rest your body and soften your breath as we begin a long and quiet walk through the forgotten alleys of medieval Europe. A time when work was not ambition, not fulfillment, but a matter of bare survival. Picture the world around the year 1250. A thick mist hangs in the early morning air. The roads are not paved, not stone, not even dry. They are mud, deep, sucking, bitter with the scent of waste and rot. The world you wake into is dim, not just from the soot-coated windows that barely let the sun through, but from the way life is lived. No hum of machines, no flick of light switches, no heaters, no elevators, no sick leave, only the weight of the next task, and the aching body that must see it through. Work, in medieval Europe, was not a choice. It was the breath between poverty and starvation. For most, it was not what you did, it was what you were. You were born into your role. If your father dug graves, you learned to hold the spade before you could write your name. If your mother cleaned chamber pots, you would learn to carry the stench in your lungs like a second skin. No contracts, no unions, no rights. Your back was your currency, your body, your only tool. And when it broke, you were discarded like rusted iron. In this world, danger wasn't occasional. It was routine. There were no safety railings, no clean gloves, just bare skin against acid, steel and fire. The only protection was a prayer, and even that felt thin in the damp morning wind. As for hygiene, a luxury for kings, and even kings knew little of what we now call clean. Disease was a co-worker, filth, a constant companion. Yet, through all this suffering, through all this invisible labor, a civilization was being held together. Its cathedrals would rise, its roads would stretch, its fields would bloom, its nobility would feast, and the gears of history would turn, not because of kings, not because of knights in shining armor, but because of hands soaked in blood, dirt, soot, and sewage. This story is not one of glory. It is not chivalry or romance. It is not the polished pages of courtly love, nor the trumpet blasts of battlefield conquest. This is the story of the jobs that no one wanted, the lives no one remembered, the labor that kept the lights on in a world without lights. We will walk slowly through the shadowed stalls of butchers, the drowning pits of tanners, the trenches of sewage, the chambers of execution, and the alleys of despair. We do not mock these people. No, we honor them by remembering. Picture this. A man awakens before dawn, not to the comfort of an alarm, but to the sharp cry of a cockerel echoing through the fog. His bed is straw, his blanket thin wool, damp with last night's cold. His hands are already aching from the day before, cracked, calloused, black beneath the nails. He does not own a mirror, but if he did, he would see the grime of yesterday still clinging to his skin. A trace of soot in his ear, a streak of blood dried on his sleeve. Today he will clean latrines, and tomorrow he may skin animals, or bury plague victims, or carry bricks up crumbling scaffolds until his legs give way. He is one among millions, men, women, children, all bound together by toil. The backbone of medieval society was not forged of stone or scripture, but of bodies, bending, breaking, and bearing the weight of a world that would never reward them. Their names are mostly lost, their stories unsung. But if we listen closely, if we walk quietly through the ages, we can hear the echoes. A heavy cartwheel dragged over cobblestones, the metallic rasp of a blade being sharpened for execution, the hiss of tallow being boiled, the cough of a miner breathing in the black powder of his tomb. There were no workplace rules, no sick pay, no health inspections. If your hand was crushed beneath the wheel, you were dismissed, not treated. If you fell ill from fumes, they would call it divine punishment, not workplace hazard. And if you died, you'd be replaced before your body was cold. These were not glamorous lives, but they were necessary. They laid the foundation for things we take for granted. Clean streets, heated homes, paved roads, leather-bound books, soap, surgery, and even the idea that a worker might deserve dignity. This is a quiet tribute to those whose work was never celebrated, the gong farmers who bathed in human waste, the leech collectors who bled for their pay, the executioners who lived in exile, the chimney sweeps who died before puberty, each of them a pillar in the cathedral of history. And so, we begin. In the trenches of medieval England, where our first labourer begins his nightly descent into a pit no one else dares to look at. Let us follow him into the world of the gong farmer. In medieval Europe, there was no plumbing, not in castles, not in manors, not even in the mighty monasteries whose bells rang out with the promise of salvation. Human waste, urine, feces, filth had no place to go. No underground maze of pipes, no flushing systems, no porcelain thrones. Instead, there were trenches, simple ditches carved through alleyways and behind houses where waste was dumped with a casual flick from chamber pots and wooden bowls. Some towns tried to channel the waste into streams or gutters, but even the streams choked on what was fed to them. Cesspits bubbled behind homes, shallow brick-lined holes where filth festered until it reached the brim. And when the pit was full, someone had to empty it. 1.2. The Job of a Gong Farmer. He was called a gong farmer. Gong, an old word for dung. He worked when others slept, by law and by necessity. For if he worked in the day, his scent would ruin the air, merchants would flee, customers would gag, priests would clutch their robes, and so he moved only by torchlight, shadows dancing against damp walls, the only sound the slosh of his boots sinking into sludge. He would open the trapdoors at the back of homes, descend into the pits, sometimes chest deep, into a stew of months-old human waste, black, viscous, buzzing with flies and disease. The bucket was his chalice. He would fill it, hand over hand, pass it to his helper above. Together they would dump the contents into carts, wooden, open, heavy with stink, to be hauled outside the city walls. And if the pit caved in, he was buried alive. In other people's filth, there were no gloves, no boots thick enough to keep it all out, only bare skin and a cloth tied across the face, useless against the rot in the air. He breathed it in, he swallowed it in sweat, he carried the stink home, and it clung to him like a ghost. His hands were always raw, the skin around his nails permanently stained, his eyes red from the ammonia fumes. Sometimes he found things: coins, rings, hair, teeth, small bones, things that had no business being down there, but had sunk like everything else. He did not ask questions, he simply shoveled. And the diseases. Oh, the diseases. Typhoid, dysentery, worms, pustules that erupted in summer, coughs that never left. Healers could do nothing. The church offered prayers, but prayers did not stop the rot. And yet, he continued, night after night, pit after pit, because someone had to, and strangely, he was paid well. Yes, for all the horror, the choking air, the endless filth, the gong farmer earned more than many craftsmen, more than a carpenter, more than a weaver, more even than a humble mason laying the stones of a church. Not because society valued him, but because no one else would do what he did. The pay was compensation, not reward, a bribe to the soul, so that a man might silence the shame that came with every shift. And make no mistake, shame followed him. He could not eat at the inn, he could not stand in the square, he could not sit in the church without drawing whispers. Children held their noses as he passed, vendors shooed him away. He was seen, but never spoken to, a necessary evil, a ghost with skin. By law, he was forbidden to work during the day, not for his safety, but for theirs. The townsfolk couldn't bear the smell, couldn't stand to see the steaming buckets, or the stains left behind by his work. So he walked when the sun was gone, under moonlight, through the hush of sleeping homes, and into the holes that no one dared look at in daylight. And when his shift ended, he didn't return to a cozy bed inside warm city walls. No, he lived on the edge, quite literally. Gong farmers were housed in fringe settlements outside the town gates, or in cramped quarters near the outer walls. Their homes were often downwind, always downwind, thin-walled, cold, built close to the waste heaps. So their journey to the dump was short. Their neighbours, others like them, rat catchers, leech collectors, the untouchables of medieval society, they formed a kind of invisible caste, vital, but voiceless. And yet, every night, as townsfolk dreamed sweetly in their wooden beds, it was the gong farmer who trudged through the dark, who bent into the pit, who scooped the city's secrets into his bucket and carried its shame on his shoulders. The irony, no one thanked him, no one remembered him. But if he didn't work, within days the town would fall into ruin. Waste would overflow into streets, sickness would rise like smoke, rats would feast, and the rich would die just as fast as the poor. The gong farmer was not just a labourer, he was the quiet spine of sanitation, a man who waded into the underbelly of civilization so others could breathe easy. And as towns grew, as populations swelled behind stone walls and timbered lanes, so too did the filth, and the burden placed on the gong farmer was no longer limited to human waste alone, because soon he was asked to clean far worse things: rotting carcasses, animal blood, spoiled hides, and the severed remnants of jobs gone wrong. And so we descend deeper, from the pits of excrement to the rivers of blood, where the smell no longer clings to your clothes, but soaks into your bones, as we step next into the world of the butcher. The smell of the cesspit gives way to something thicker, sharper, the scent of iron, warm, wet, and unmistakable. Blood. You've stepped out of the trench, only to find yourself at the foot of another. But this one runs red. In the winding alleys of medieval towns, tucked behind taverns and beside the tanneries, stood the shambles, a place not of rest, but of slaughter. Here the butcher worked, sun or snow, rain or rot, with knives that never cooled, and hands that never came clean. There was no refrigeration, no ice, no storage. Every animal, once killed, began to decay from the moment its heart stopped. So the work was done quickly, brutally. A pig squeals, a goat thrashes, a cow collapses. The butcher moves in rhythm, slit, drain, skin, gut, and toss. Behind him, piles of offal build up. Livers, intestines, gallbladders, still twitching with post-mortem spasm. Flies swarm thick in the air, drawn by the promise of saltless meat left to spoil. Beneath his feet, rivers of blood carve channels through the dirt, mixing with sawdust, forming puddles of copper-coloured sludge. Children tiptoe past with sleeves over their noses. Dogs dart in and out, stealing scraps. Rats have made homes under the chopping blocks. It is a place of carnage, and yet it feeds the town. Butchers were essential. Without them, no meat. Without meat, no strength. And in a time of famine and fasts, even a tough joint of ox muscle was precious. Still, their work made them suspect, because when the plague came, it always seemed to start near the shambles. Doctors, of course, knew little of germs. They blamed bad air, rotten food, sin, and what better place to find all three than the butcher's yard? Some said it was the blood, some the offal dumped into open drains. Others feared the animals themselves, that death had lingered too long in their eyes before the blade struck. And so butchers became both feared and needed, fed and avoided, praised and cursed. They were not just vendors of meat, they were gatekeepers of decay. But when the meat was carved and the bones scraped clean, another labourer stepped in, not for the flesh, but for the skin. Leather was life, shoes for travel, straps for armour, pouches for coins, scrolls for scripture, bindings for books, saddles for horses, gloves for archers, and all of it began in rot. The tanner was the one who transformed skin into something useful, and to do so, he had to first destroy it. Tanneries were almost always set outside the town walls, and not by choice, by decree, because the stench was inhuman. Imagine this. Dozens of animal hides soaked in dog urine, collected from alley buckets, rubbed with lime to burn away the hair, then bathed in human excrement to soften the remaining tissue, a bath of bile, a pool of waste. The hides sat in pits for days, sometimes weeks, until the hair could be scraped clean, until the skin was pliable, like wet parchment. The tanner stood waist deep in these vats, his hands submerged in filth, his eyes watering, his lungs burning. The ammonia in the urine ate away at his nostrils, his skin cracked, peeled, infected. But he continued, because leather was precious and the process unchanged for centuries. He would beat the hides with wooden paddles, stretch them, salt them, smoke them, rub them with oils until they dried into something strong enough to be worn on the feet of a knight or the cover of a monk's Bible. But the price was his own body, and the place he worked wasn't a workshop, it was a wound that bled poison into the air and into the soil. The ground around tanneries, black, oily, dead. Birds would not fly over them. Children were warned to never play near them. Even thieves kept away, because the smell was unspeakable, a smell of things part living, a smell of old death, warmed by the sun. And still, the town depended on him for boots, belts, books, bags. He was the silent craftsman of civilization. But the craft was dangerous, and every day spent scraping hide was another day closer to sickness, to blindness, to infection, to wounds that never healed. The lime used to burn off hair, also burned flesh. It seeped into the tiniest cuts, made the skin raw, peeled away nails. The urine made the feet rot, turned the palms pale and cracked. Every handshake felt like touching parchment, and the hides themselves, they were never fresh. Some arrived riddled with maggots, some already half rotten, especially in summer. The flies hovered thick above the vats, laying eggs in the folds. Sometimes the tanner scraped flesh from a hide, only to find it moving. They pressed on. They had to, because there was no other work, and no one else willing to touch the rot. And when the hides were done, when the meat was gone, and the bones dried brittle, there was still something left to clean, the bits no one could use, the parts no one wanted, and someone had to dispose of it, because the city never slept, and death was always just around the next corner. The refuse of butchers, the foul remnants of slaughterhouses and tanneries didn't vanish on their own. They rotted, underfoot, underwater, under homes. The stench drifted across market squares, creeping through cracks in stone walls, nestling beneath the noses of those who could afford not to care. But someone, always someone, was tasked with carrying it away. Not just the bones, not just the spoiled meat, but what lingered afterward. The ground beneath the medieval city was layered in suffering. Rivers of blood carved grooves through cobblestone. Cartloads of discarded flesh were wheeled out beyond the gates. Slaughter waste was sometimes dumped into nearby streams, tainting the very water used for drinking and cooking. And when a disease passed through livestock, entire piles of infected carcasses would be burned outside the walls, sending black smoke into the sky, a smoke that clung to clothes and soaked into skin. These scenes were not rare, they were routine, and for those paid to deal with them, there was no break, no respite, only filth and fire, and endless rot. It was not the sight of blood that broke a man, it was the smell, the persistence of it, in the hair, in the tongue, in the folds of skin. A butcher could eat no pork without gagging, a tanner would dream of bile, and their children grew up learning to hold their breath. Yet this was the cost of a functioning town. You wanted meat, you needed the butcher. You wanted boots, you needed the tanner. You wanted clean streets, even after death. Then someone had to come and take away what the others left behind. And in the dark hours of the morning, while the butchers were scrubbing knives, and the tanners were boiling hides, a different figure emerged. A quieter figure, pale, silent, with a shovel and a prayer, stepping toward the graves of the forgotten. In medieval Europe, death was not a visitor, it was a neighbour, a frequent familiar presence, one whose footsteps echoed behind every cough, and whose breath lingered in every winter chill. Life was short, disease, swift, childbirth, perilous, war, constant, and the grave was always near. But there was a problem. Towns grew, and so did the number of corpses, and cemeteries did not grow with them. Behind stone chapels and crooked churches, small plots of sacred ground filled with the bodies of the faithful. Burials were performed quickly, no embalming, no deep graves, just linen, soil and stone, and in time those graves began to fill. One by one, row by row, the earth became crowded, the dead stacked atop the dead, 3, 4, even 5 layers deep, and when there was no more room, when a new death arrived and no plot remained, the old graves were opened, the ground torn up, the bones removed, skulls lifted, still bearing the memory of a name now long forgotten. The dead were disturbed to make room for the newly dead. And someone had to do that work. A man with a shovel, with boots thick with soil, with hands that had touched what others would not even look at. He was not a priest, not a monk, not a mourner. He was a grave digger. His job was not simply to bury, it was to manage the dead, to create space, to maintain order, to keep the holy ground from collapsing into chaos. He worked in silence. He was not expected to pray, only to dig. In winter, with frost-bitten fingers. In summer, with flies buzzing thick around his face. He dug graves, and he emptied them, pulling bones from the soil as gently as he could, not out of reverence, but because a snapped skull meant more work. The bodies he disturbed were not always dust. Sometimes they were recent, still damp, still clothed, still staring, and yet the ground demanded space, so he removed them, layer by layer, grave by grave, and the question became what to do with the bones. Enter another worker, quieter still, less spoken of, the charnel worker. He did not dig, he sorted, he cleaned, he arranged in dark vaults beneath churches, in small rooms behind the altar, or in hidden crypts with low ceilings and colder air. The bones were gathered, skulls in rows, femurs in stacks, spines curled like dried vines, everything in its place. Because bones were not discarded, they were holy, remnants of the faithful, so they were stored with care, or with art. Some ossuaries became monuments of bone, walls lined with rib cages, crosses made of humerus and tibia, chandeliers woven from vertebrae. To some, it was reverent, to others, grotesque. But to the worker, it was a job, a quiet craft where dust was never swept away, because it might belong to someone's grandmother. The charnel worker wore no mask, his fingers were always grey, and he knew by sight how to tell the skull of a woman from that of a child, or a soldier. He worked alone, spoke little, and bore the strange burden of making beauty, out of remains. But beauty could only last so long, because when the plague came, there was no time for artistry, there was only the pit. It did not arrive with thunder, nor lightning, nor the clash of swords. It came in silence, on the back of a flea, in the fur of a rat, or perhaps in the breath of a stranger. The plague, when it came, moved faster than grief and deeper than prayer. One day, a cough, the next, a swelling, then a fever, then a death, then 2, then 10, then hundreds. The gravedigger could not keep up. The priest lost his voice from last rites. The church bells rang until the ropes snapped, and the graveyards overflowed so quickly. It was as if the earth itself had no more room. There were no longer names, no longer coffins, no longer blessings, just bodies, stacked, lined, laid, naked or clothed, young or old, saint or sinner. None were spared, none were separate. Mass graves were dug, deep and wide, sometimes with tools, other times with bare hands, by those who still breathed, but barely. The bodies were thrown in quickly. Lime was scattered over them, quicklime, to burn and dissolve the flesh. It hissed as it struck the skin, like a warning, like a curse. Then another layer of bodies, then more lime, then soil, and again. Those who dug did not stop to mourn. They could not. They tied cloth over their faces, soaked in wine or vinegar or nothing, and still they breathed in death, through nose, through eye, through cut. They carried the plague without knowing, spread it in their homes, their sweat, their breath. Many grave diggers died within days, and their bodies were tossed into the same pits they had carved. There was no distinction, not even for them. But others kept going, because someone had to, and the charnel worker, he stopped sorting, stopped arranging. He simply swept bones into bags, or let the piles rise, because now death was no longer a procession, it was an avalanche. The smell was beyond words, beyond comprehension. It soaked into the very wood of the town, into the stones of the church, into the breath of the priest. The bells stopped ringing, the windows were shuttered, even the rats grew fat and bold. And the workers of death, grave diggers, charnel men, bone carriers, they did not wear armour, they did not bear swords, they bore the weight of a dying city on carts, on shoulders, on souls. And when the tide of plague finally broke, when the air began to clear, they were still there, still digging, still burying, still walking through fields of skulls and rib cages, trying to make sense of what had just passed. But not all death came from disease. Some came by decree, and some men were not tasked with burying the dead, but with creating them. The town is quiet again, but not from peace. No birdsong, no children playing, only a hush, the kind that thickens the air when people know that someone is about to die. A scaffold stands at the edge of the square, weathered wood, dark with old stains. The rope swings gently in the wind, and beneath it, a man waits. He does not speak, he does not pray. His face is hidden beneath a hood, and though all eyes will soon be on him, not a soul dares meet his gaze. He is not welcome in the market, not allowed inside the church, not invited to weddings, or mourned at funerals, and yet he is the one they need most when law breaks. The executioner, the hangman, the blade bearer, the headsman. His title changed by town, by dialect, by century, but the weight of his duty never did. He was hated, feared, despised. But he was also paid, sometimes more than the town magistrate, because while no one wished to look upon him, they all expected him to perform his duty. Justice had to be served, and someone had to swing the axe. He was often inherited into the role, the son of a headsman, trained by blood, marked by name. He could not escape his work, and the work could not be ignored. He lived on the fringes of town, near gallows, or beside the execution ground. Some towns gave him lodging and coin, others only protection from mobs, because without him, law was toothless. With him, law was terrifying. He could not enter churches. The killing of men, even by order, made him unclean in the eyes of many. His hands, they said, were soaked in sin, even if his heart was not. So he stood in shadows, listened from doorways, and drank alone. But each time a bell rang for justice, he returned, rope in hand, blade sharpened, heart numb. His job was to kill, with precision, in public, on command. A hanging at dawn, a beheading by noon, a flogging before supper. Crowds would gather, mothers, children, drunkards, eager to see blood. They shouted, they jeered, they clapped when heads fell, they laughed when the condemned cried. But the executioner did not laugh. He rarely spoke, because to him this was not entertainment, it was work. And when the crowd dispersed, he remained, to clean the blood, to dispose of limbs, to carry the head, to remove the rope, to burn the clothes. He scrubbed the block, sharpened the blade, and waited for the next command. Some went mad, others turned cruel, many drank, to forget, because no one told them what to do with the nightmares, of eyes that stared up after death, of necks that snapped the wrong way, of children who were too small, but sentenced anyway. The job demanded silence, and so they buried it all, under black hoods and thicker skin. And still, there were worse tasks, not the swift, but the slow, not execution, but torture. In cold stone chambers, below castles, beneath town halls, in damp rooms where the light of day never reached, men screamed, not from war, not from sickness, but from the slow, methodical breaking of the body. Torture was not chaos. It was calculated, precise, legal in many cases, approved by courts, councils, and kings. It was not vengeance, it was information, a confession, a name, a plea, and the one who administered it, often the same man who swung the sword, the executioner. His duties extended beyond the scaffold. He was summoned into darkness to take up tools, not of death, but of pain, ropes, cranks, irons, weights. The goal was not to kill, not yet. The goal was to hurt, to draw out truth or lies through agony, to punish slowly, to make a man beg to be executed. He would begin with the rack, the condemned strapped down, arms pulled one way, legs the other. A slow turn of the wheel, tighter, tighter still. Ligaments tear like parchment, bones stretch, screams echo down corridors no one else dares walk. If that failed, he might move to crushing. The boot, an iron casing fitted around the leg. With each hammer blow, the bones inside were shattered, bit by bit. The victim stayed alive, awake, present, always present. Other times it was heat, a cauldron of oil, a brazier of coals, or rods heated until they glowed, used not to kill, but to sear the will, to brand the skin, to coax the tongue. There were no clean uniforms, no procedures, only screams and silence. The executioner did not speak much. He had heard every kind of cry, every language of pain, every version of pleas. He did not flinch. He could not afford to. Sometimes the condemned died on the table, too weak, too broken, too consumed by suffering. When that happened, it was seen as justice, not failure. The body would be carried out, dumped, buried shallow, or displayed as warning, and the executioner, he would wash his hands, sharpen his blades, and wait, because pain always returned, and so did those who ordered it. The executioner's chamber was a museum of agony, each tool a masterpiece of cruelty. The scavenger's daughter, a metal brace that crushed the body inward, forcing limbs against chest, bones against organs. A person would bleed from the ears and still live. The rack, wood and rope, simple, elegant in its horror. It did not cut, it pulled, until joints snapped, until the body forgot itself. The Iron Maiden, perhaps more legend than reality, but feared nonetheless. A coffin of metal, lined with spikes, designed not to kill quickly, but to pierce the soft parts, the stomach, the thighs, just enough to bleed slowly. There were thumbscrews, neck clamps, tongue tearers, breast rippers. Each had a purpose. Each was made by human hands, to break other human hands. They were cleaned, rarely. Blood dried in their hinges. Screams echoed from their touch. And yet they were stored with care. Oiled, maintained, respected. Because in this world, tools of torture were tools of order. They kept society in line. They made the rebellious tremble. They were the whisper behind every law. But not all pain came from the dungeon, and not every instrument of torment was held by an executioner's hand. Some were hidden beneath robes. Pain in the Middle Ages was not just a tool, it was a belief, a ritual, a form of cleansing. And in the sacred halls of the church, where incense masked the smell of rot, and candles flickered against icons of mercy, there were those assigned the dirtiest work of all. Behind the silence of prayer, beyond the carved cloisters and whispered chants, lay the latrines, the cloaca, the communal toilet of monks. It was no small chamber. It was a dark, sunless chute, sometimes several stories deep, positioned beneath rows of wooden seats. Dozens of monks, one after another, relieving themselves in quiet succession into the same abyss. There was no plumbing, only gravity and faith, and at the bottom, someone waited, a monk, hood drawn low, hands cracked from cold, shovel in one, bucket in the other. His task to clean, to descend into the pit where days, weeks of waste had gathered, to scoop, to carry, to dump. Winter was the worst, the air was colder, but the latrines never stopped, and the water froze. The sludge thickened, the smell intensified. The monk breathed it all in, ammonia, mould, sour rot. His robe clung to his skin, soaked through, and beneath his bare feet the stone was ice. Yet he worked, silently, without complaint, because this too was devotion. Latrine duty rotated, but some monks, especially the younger ones or those from lesser birth, were assigned to it more often, sometimes permanently. It was considered humbling, a path to discipline, a way to break the ego, and for some, it broke the body too. The toll was quiet but cruel. Chronic dysentery spread fast. Cracked skin became infected, sores along the thighs, fungus on the feet, blood in the stool. But prayers did not grant immunity, only duty and repetition. The buckets were emptied by hand, sometimes into pits, sometimes into fields, sometimes simply dumped over walls. The work never ended, because even in holy places, the bowels did not rest. But there was another burden, even stranger, even darker, not of filth, but of sin. They did not wear robes, they were not ordained, they stood at the very edges of faith, half in shadow, half in service. The sin-eater, he was not a priest, but when a soul was believed to have died, unshriven, without confession, without absolution, he was called. A bowl of food was placed on the chest of the dead, bread, salt, ale, sometimes meat if the family could afford it, and the sin-eater would come, take the food, eat it slowly, in complete silence. In doing so, he was believed to absorb the sins of the departed, to carry them away, to take them upon himself. It was a ritual of desperation, half Christian, half pagan, whispered of in fear, and practiced in secret, because no priest would bless a sin-eater, no monk would dine with him, no bishop would speak his name. He was considered unclean, spiritually infected. The sins he bore were not just imagined. People believed they clung to him, stained his soul, warped his breath. Children were warned not to touch him. Mothers crossed themselves when he passed. Yet he was paid a few coins, a crust of bread, sometimes nothing more than a whispered thanks, and he accepted it, because someone had to eat, and someone had to bear the guilt that no one else dared carry. But what happens when you eat guilt for a living? To live as a sin-eater was to carry a burden no eye could see, and no soul could cleanse. He was called when death came suddenly, when the priest was too late, when a man died in rage or fear, or with secrets unspoken. The family mourned, the villagers whispered, but the sin-eater, he was summoned without fanfare. He sat at the foot of the corpse, a loaf placed on the chest, a mug at the side, sometimes salt sprinkled across the face to bind the ritual, to hold the spirit, and he ate, in silence, slowly, because to eat too fast would mean disrespect. To eat too slow was to tempt the spirit to linger. Each bite was believed to draw the sin from the body, each sip a cleansing, each swallow a soul freed. And when the meal was done, he would nod, stand, and leave. No blessings, no goodbyes. The family would not look him in the eye. They would not speak to him again, not until death visited them too. He was the last to touch the dead, and the first to be forgotten. But the guilt, the sin, was his now, so they said. He was not permitted in churches, not allowed to kneel beside others, not invited to baptisms or weddings. He stood at the edge of cemeteries and watched burials from a distance. And when his time came to die, no sin eater would come for him, because who could consume a lifetime of other people's transgressions? Some believed he would be damned, others pitied him, but none wanted to become him. He was necessary, but not loved, a creature of spiritual maintenance, neither priest nor peasant, but something in between, something haunted. This was the reality for those whose labour was invisible, not measured in strength or scars, but in loneliness, in the smell that clung to the robes of the latrine monk, and the silence that followed the sin-eater. Holy places had their filth, their burden, their darkness, and sometimes the greatest suffering wore the face of service. Because while the church preached healing, it often failed to provide it, and in the absence of cures, in the shadows of monasteries and overrun streets, when prayer and penance failed, another figure stepped forward, razor in one hand, bloodletting bowl in the other, not a priest, not a doctor, but something far more dangerous, the barber-surgeon. In the Middle Ages, the line between healer and butcher was thin, and sometimes there was no line at all. Barbers, yes, barbers, were not just the keepers of beards, they were the keepers of bodies. You didn't go to a surgeon, you went to the man with the sharpest knife and the strongest stomach. Barbers pulled teeth, they cut out abscesses, they lanced boils, they drained infected wounds, they sawed off limbs, they stitched torn flesh, and when your blood was too thick, they let it out. Bloodletting was not only common, it was believed. Too much blood, they said, caused fevers, too much bile brought madness, too much phlegm, melancholy. The solution? A knife, a vein, a bowl. The barber would slice open your arm, or behind your ear, or in your ankle, and the blood would flow, dark, warm, sticky with illness. This was considered relief, a cleansing, though many left weaker than they came, and some never stood again. He kept his tools close, knives, razors, needles, hung from his belt, wrapped in cloth, tucked in wooden boxes that smelled of rust and old sweat. You could find him on a stool in the square, or beneath an awning, or, if you were lucky, in a corner of an apothecary's shop. But comfort, that was not included. There was no anesthesia, no numbing, no mercy. If your tooth ached, he'd place a knee on your chest, grip your jaw with one hand and yank with the other. If your leg was infected, he'd tie it down, wipe the blade on his tunic and saw. The saws were not made for precision, they were made to work fast. The longer the cut, the more blood spilled, the more likely the patient would die of shock. The screams were normal, expected, sometimes muffled with leather straps between the teeth, sometimes not. The tools were reused, between patients, between days. Boil lances dipped in murky water, razors streaked with dried blood, hooks stained brown from yesterday's surgery. There was no concept of sterilization, no gloves, no understanding of microbes. If a wound turned black, they blamed the air, or the patient's humours, and the barber kept working. It was brutal, it was terrifying, and yet it was medicine of a kind. When the blade had done its work, when the limb was off, when the skin lay open like torn cloth, when the blood poured too fast for bandage or prayer, the barber would turn to fire, cauterization, the ancient seal, a metal rod, heated in coals until it glowed red, not orange, not warm, but blazing, like the eye of a furnace. He would press it to the wound, a hiss, a scream, the stench of burning flesh. It stopped the bleeding, or most of it. It also seared nerves, caused infection, and sometimes stopped the heart from the shock alone. But there was no other way. There were no clamps, no transfusions, just heat and pain. Other times he'd pour boiling wine into the gash, a form of disinfecting, crude but strangely effective. It burned, it stunned, it scalded the inner skin. But in a world without penicillin, boiled wine was a kind of mercy. If not wine, then vinegar. If not vinegar, urine. Yes, even that, because anything acidic was believed to clean, even if it did not. The bandages, scraps of cloth, sometimes clean, often not, wrapped tightly, soaked with blood, and replaced only when they stuck to the wound. A patient who survived such treatment was considered lucky, a patient who walked again. Miraculous. But miracles were rare, most healed badly, limps, twisted joints, chronic infections, phantom pain. Still, they lived, and that in itself was something. The barber's duties didn't end with surgery. He was also the dentist, and for teeth. There was only one answer: pliers, rusty, heavy, worn from use. Toothaches in the Middle Ages weren't solved with fillings. There was no drilling, no numbing gel, only pliers, and the hope that the root wouldn't break off. The barber would grip the tooth, twist, pull, sometimes once, sometimes over and over again. The gum would bleed, the jaw would bruise, the pain would echo for days, but the ache would be gone. He also applied leeches, for bloodletting, for fever, for humour balance. The leeches were kept in jars, fed with warm cloth, used again and again. They'd be placed behind the ears, on the neck, the thighs, even the temples, and they would drink, slowly, silently, drawing blood and superstition out of the flesh. Children cried at the sight of them. Adults fainted from the loss of blood, but the barber kept jars full because customers demanded it, because it was medicine, because it was tradition, because it was all they had. And when the barber had done all he could, when the arm was gone, the tooth was pulled, the blood was drained, he packed his tools, folded his cloth, and moved on to the next town, the next wound, the next suffering. Because bodies were always breaking, and disease was always waiting, and when no surgeon could help, when no priest could heal, when the bones twisted and the breath turned foul, it was time to turn to something dirtier still. Not doctors, not monks, but those who cleaned the aftermath of the plague. It began in 1347, in whispers, in ports, in rats. Within 4 years, it had devoured nearly half of Europe, from London to Florence, from the Baltic to the Pyrenees. Death travelled faster than any army. It had no name at first, only symptoms: a fever, a swelling, a blackening of the flesh. Then came vomiting, bleeding from the eyes, delirium, and then stillness. No one understood it. Some thought it was a curse, others a punishment from God. Many simply fled, but someone had to stay. Someone had to care for the sick, to touch the dying, to carry the bodies, and so entered the plague doctors. Clad in long robes, thick gloves, boots, and a terrifying mask, shaped like the beak of a bird. The mask was filled with herbs. Lavender, mint, cloves, rose petals, not for healing, but for endurance, to hide the stench of death. The beak protruded far, like the nose of some spectral crow, and the eyes covered with glass. To the people they looked less like healers and more like omens. But these men, they walked where others would not. Into homes of the infected, into alleyways slick with bile, into plague pits, with only cloth between them and the end. The dead came faster than graves could be dug, faster than names could be written, faster than the earth could open. And so they were carried, by day, by night, by men who could not afford to flee, cart pullers, grave servants, plague attendants. They walked with scarves wrapped around their faces, with cloves between their teeth, with empty eyes. The bodies they lifted, twisted, swollen, covered in black pustules the size of fists. Some wept blood, some still breathed. There was no time to be sure. They tossed them onto carts, stacked high, then wheeled them through the streets. "Bring out your dead," some cried, not from cruelty, but from necessity, because if the bodies stayed inside, the household would follow. At the edge of town, pits were dug, broad, shallow, quickly made. The corpses were dumped, sprinkled with quicklime, to burn the flesh, covered in soil, and forgotten. No prayers, no funerals, no names, and the men who buried them, they returned home, already coughing. They vomited in the street, collapsed beside their own carts. Some died before the pit was closed, and when they did, another man was sent to finish the job, because the plague did not pause. But plague didn't rise from the grave. It crept from the shadows, from the rafters, from the thatch and the cellar, in the form of a rat, small, fast, harmless to look at, but under its fur nested fleas, and in the belly of those fleas, death. Enter the rat catcher. He was not a doctor, not a scholar, just a man with a sack, a stick, and the ability to go where no one else dared, underneath homes, beneath floorboards, into drains, behind barrels in cellars thick with damp. He crawled through basements, his knees scraping stone, his face pressed against rotten beams. He set traps, he baited hooks, he cornered nests, he smashed skulls. It was never clean, never quick, sometimes dozens in a day, sometimes hundreds. And the rats, they didn't go quietly. They bit, they scratched, they squealed, high, shrill, furious, and sometimes they won. The rat catcher's hands were often covered in bites, punctured skin, swollen joints, infected cuts. Some lost fingers, some their lives, but they kept going, because if they didn't, the plague would come faster. And there was no glory in the work, no crowds applauding, no prayers offered, just a sack of twitching tails, and the constant crawling of skin, as if the fleas had found you too. In the face of suffering, when medicine failed, when prayers seemed unanswered, people turned to myth. They whispered that cats were the cause, their glowing eyes, their quiet ways, their independence, all suspicious. So they were hunted, killed in droves, drowned, burned, skinned and hung from doors to ward off evil. But fewer cats meant more rats, and the plague only worsened. Others believed it was the air, so they carried pomanders, balls of herbs and perfume, or burned bundles of sage and lavender. Some walked with flowers tucked into their collars, believing the scent would shield them. Ring-a-ring of roses wasn't just a rhyme, it was a warning, a pocket full of posies, to mask the stink of sickness. Ashes, ashes. We all fall down. There were those who blamed foreigners, or Jews, or lepers. They were rounded up, driven out, burned alive, because fear is louder than reason, and superstition travels faster than rats. Some believed in witches, that the plague was sent by hexes, that the old woman with herbs was to blame, that the midwife had cursed the village, so women were hanged or drowned or beaten. Until the screaming stopped, it made no difference. The plague continued. Even the doctors, even the clergy, did not know what to believe. Only the grave diggers knew the truth. That death has no reason, no favourite, no pattern, it simply comes. And when the last bell tolled, when the carts stopped rolling, when the rat catcher's sack hung still, something else took its place in the shadows. Not pestilence, but people. Not the sick, but the wicked. Because crime did not vanish in plague, it grew. The plague had quieted, the rats had scattered, the bells rang less often now, but the nights remained dangerous. The dead no longer piled up in wagons, but something else moved through the alleys now, slower, quieter, more deliberate, human shadows, with knives tucked under cloaks, with whispers darker than the moonless sky. And while the nobleman slept behind his iron-banded door, someone else walked the streets, alone, tired, cold, with nothing but a lantern, and fear. There were no police in medieval Europe, no detectives, no uniforms, no call for backup. There were only watchmen, ordinary men, poorly trained, usually older, or too injured to work the fields. They carried staves, long sticks of wood, sometimes whistles, rarely blades. They weren't paid well, if at all. Many were pressed into service as a form of civic duty, a rotation, a punishment. Walk the night, the constable might say, and mark what you see. And so they walked, from sunset to dawn, through streets narrow as hallways, through courtyards thick with smoke, over cobblestones slick with mud, or worse. They called the hour aloud as they passed, 10 of the clock, and all is well. Midnight strikes, keep your candles close. But often, all was not well. The towns they patrolled were not quiet. They were bubbling cauldrons of crime, especially after dark, and the watchman was alone. They dealt with the kind of danger no sermon could tame. Fights broke out in taverns, fires sparked in crowded tenements, thieves skulked through windows, drunks collapsed in gutters, assaults behind bakeries, knifings in the market shade, and when it happened, it was the watchman who ran toward the sound, or, if he was wise, watched from afar and survived. Some were brave, most were terrified, and for good reason. They were often beaten, mocked, spat on. Some were stabbed in back alleys. Others simply disappeared, their lanterns found smashed in the street. There were no metal badges to shield them, no backup waiting at the gate. Only the knowledge that if they fell, someone else would walk the next night, and perhaps fare no better. And when they tried to solve crimes, their tools were crude. They had no fingerprints, no forensics, no magnifying glass or science, only eyes, ears, and suspicion. If a theft occurred, they'd knock on doors, ask questions, sniff the air for lies, and when they suspected someone, the methods of proof were brutal. The accused might be made to hold a red-hot iron bar, or submerged in water. If they burned, they were guilty. If they floated, guilty still. If they sank and drowned, innocent, but too late. It was called trial by ordeal, a superstition dressed as justice. The watchman did not question it, he enforced it, because truth was too fragile a thing in those streets. They worked through fog, through sleet, through shouting, and when their shift ended, they returned home, not to honour, not to thanks, just sleep, if it came, and the knowledge that crime never slept. But not all of medieval danger lived in alleys or darkened doorways. Some laboured below, beneath the earth, where daylight never reached, where breath was thin and silence was absolute, where the risk was not knives, but collapse, and the lightest misstep meant being buried alive. When the stars fade and the sun dares to rise, it never touches where these men go. Their world is not one of wind and sky, but of stone and dust, and a darkness so total it feels alive. They descend not into hell by metaphor, but into its very mouth. They are miners, they are quarrymen, and the earth does not forgive them easily. Before there were cranes, before there were drills, before safety helmets and steel supports, there was the pick, the shovel, the rope, the hope. Medieval mines were narrow shafts, sometimes dug straight down, sometimes carved into hillsides, always perilous. Men lowered themselves by ladder or rope, or crawling on their stomachs, mouths pressed close to wet stone. Their tools were simple: hammer, chisel, wedge. Their strength, all they had, and their light, a candle, one, flickering in a pool of tallow, casting shadows across walls that threatened to close in at any moment. One gust, one cough, and the world went black. They mined for iron, to make swords, tools, chains, for salt, to preserve meat, to flavour meals, to trade across kingdoms, and coal, dirty, volatile, barely understood, but growing in demand. The shafts were tight, the air damp, often unbreathable, and the deeper they dug, the hotter it became. Some collapsed, the ceiling gave way, a timber cracked, and tons of stone poured down. No warning, no escape, just sudden silence. Those who survived the day emerged caked in black, their lungs heavy, their limbs trembling, and they still had to carry their findings. Up ladders, across jagged tunnels, sometimes on their backs, sometimes dragging sacks tied with ropes around their waists. A misstep could cost a limb, a fall, a life, and yet they returned, day after day, because the world above demanded what lay below. But some mines held worse things than stone. Some held poison. In the hidden corners of Europe, alchemy had taken root, a strange, glimmering promise to turn base metals into gold, to distill perfection, to touch eternity. And so, deep beneath certain hills, men were sent to mine mercury and arsenic. They did not know the names, only the weight, the shine. Mercury, silver as moonlight, liquid, cold, strange. It slipped through fingers, it soaked through skin, and it killed. Slowly, tremors, madness, blindness, breathlessness. They called it mad miner's sickness. They thought it was just exhaustion, but it was the metal working through blood and bone. Arsenic was worse. Its dust hung in the air, sweet-smelling, invisible. A miner would cough, spit blood, lose weight, lose teeth. Their skin turned pale, their minds confused. But the alchemists above needed more, always more, for their flasks, for their flames, for their endless experiment to create gold from suffering. And when the miner collapsed, when he could no longer hold the pickaxe, when he went silent, another man stepped in took his place, tied the rope around his waist, and descended into the same poisoned dark. But even in the open air, some labours were no less deadly. Not all stone was hidden deep below, some was carved from the open earth, in places where the sun baked the skin and the wind whipped fine dust into the eyes. The quarry, a wide wound in the land, a place of chisels and sweat, of hammer strikes echoing like thunder off the stone. Here, men worked in the open air, but they did not breathe freely. They chipped at limestone, granite, slate, for castles, bridges, churches, the skeleton of Europe's pride. But every strike sent a mist of stone into the air, fine, pale, deadly. It crept into lungs, coated tongues, and settled deep, where breath could not reach. They coughed, at first only after work, then during, then constantly. Chests wheezed like broken bellows. Spit turned red. Some collapsed mid-blow. They called it stone lung, or said it was just a weak chest. But the truth, they were drowning in dust. The quarrymen's hands were blistered and split, their backs bent, shoulders raw from hauling slabs, and their ears numbed by years of hammering. Rockfalls were common, a misjudged strike, a slipped wedge, and a wall of stone came crashing down. Bones broke like twigs, skulls cracked on boulders. There was no siren, no rescue, only silence, and the slow, reluctant clearing of rubble. Still, they came back, because stone meant coin, and coin meant bread. The churches they helped build offered them no sanctuary. The tombs they carved would never hold their names, and the statues they raised stood in honour of kings, never the quarryman. Day after day, they dug, they chiselled, they breathed the death rising from beneath their feet, but not all medieval labour dealt with dust. Some faced something wetter, squirming, slippery, with teeth and slime, because when they weren't breaking the bones of the earth, they were collecting its most revolting creatures with their bare hands. Leeches, tiny, black, pulsing worms, soft as wet leather and insatiable. They were considered precious because they were medicine. In medieval Europe, blood was the source of all balance. Too much of it, the doctors said, and illness would take root. So blood had to be drawn, and leeches were the most civilized way to do it. So someone had to find them. That someone was often a woman. Poor, unmarried, shunned, she would walk barefoot into marshes, into the still waters behind cattle fields, or in forgotten corners of forests, where frogs croaked and mosquitoes fed in clouds. She moved slowly, deliberately, because leeches sense warmth, and if she stood still long enough, they would come, first to the ankles, then the calves, then higher. She let them latch, let them bite, let them drink, and then gently she peeled them off, dropped them into clay jars or damp cloth sacks, sometimes a dozen, sometimes 50, depending on how long she could stand, before dizziness set in, because they didn't just bite, they bled her, and the blood didn't stop. Some wounds flowed for hours, there was no way to seal them. She would return to the village pale, unsteady, her legs dotted with blood like a second set of freckles, and still she was paid in pennies, or not at all, because the physicians profited, the nobles healed, she only bled. And if leeches lived in wetness, something worse thrived in the dry. In fields just beyond the manor walls where livestock grazed and the earth was churned with hooves, another figure crouched, a dung farmer. He was not a peasant in the traditional sense. He didn't sow, he didn't reap, he collected horse manure, cow dung, chicken droppings, pig waste, by hand, with rake and basket, with wooden shovel and leather sack. He waded through maggots, swatted at flies that landed on lips and eyelids, and breathed through his mouth because the stench was too thick to block. In summer, the piles steamed. In winter, they froze and had to be cracked with a stick before they could be gathered. He shoveled all of it into carts, barrels, troughs, because dung was gold. It fertilized fields, made wheat taller, turnips richer, grapes fuller. No harvest was healthy without it, and yet he was reviled. Children ran from him, women pinched their noses, priests held their breath when he passed. He was filth incarnate, and every night when he returned home, the smell clung to him, to his bed, to his hands, to the skin beneath his nails. No amount of scrubbing made it leave, because it wasn't just on him, it was in him. It was not just manure he carried, it was also ashes, spoiled food, rotten hay, animal carcasses picked clean by dogs. All of it waste, all of it useful, because the medieval world ran on a strange, unseen engine, one powered not by gold but by decay. This was the filth economy. The dung farmer was its gear, spinning without thanks, without pause. He supplied compost for crops. He sold refuse to tanners. Even butchers gave him fat and bone fragments to haul away. He fed the pigs of noble estates with things others threw out. He piled waste for fermenting, let it heat, bubble, cook under the sun until it turned black and rich. Then he sold it to farmers, to apothecaries, even to perfumers who needed ammonia-rich material for their tinctures. And yet, for all this essential labour, he was never touched, never invited in. At the edge of every field, he'd leave the sacks, collect his coin if they remembered to leave it, and walk away. But infection was never far, a scratch from a thorned weed, a cut from a splintered rake, a fly landing on an open wound, and suddenly, fever, swelling, delirium. There were no gloves, no boots, no remedies, just rot, and the long wait to see if the body would endure. He worked with what the world rejected. He fed the roots of empires while his own body withered, and when he died, the town simply found another, because waste never stopped, and someone always had to lift it. But not all hardship was measured in filth. Not all suffering soaked the skin or burned the throat. Some labours were clean on the outside, but cruel in spirit. They did not cover the body in grime, but twisted the heart and hardened the soul. These were the tasks that demanded no mud, no leeches, no dung, only the ability to look another human being in the eye and break them. By now you've heard the screams from the scaffold, you've stood in the plague pits, you've walked beside the dung cart, but there's a cruelty, quieter, more chilling, one that doesn't leave bruises on the body alone, but on the soul, not inflicted by nobles or knights or priests, but by the keepers of poverty, those tasked not with helping the poor, but with hunting them. The cities grew, and so did the number of mouths, with nothing to feed them, children orphaned by plague, men injured by labour, widows abandoned in alleys. They wandered the streets, thin, barefoot, begging, and the ruling class grew uneasy. Poverty, they believed, was contagious, a stain, a threat to order. So they passed the poor laws, a patchwork of regulations across Europe, designed not to aid the suffering, but to hide them, and someone had to enforce it. Enter the child catcher, the beggar whipper, the beadle, in some towns, men armed not with kindness but with clubs, hooks, ropes. Many were ex-criminals, men who had once begged themselves, now offered coin to round up the very people they once stood among. They stalked the streets like hunters, dragging children from corners, beating vagrants who lingered too long, tossing bodies into carts not for burial but for forced labour. The destination? Workhouses, grim institutions where the poor were taught discipline through hunger, where children laboured from dawn until dark, where prayer replaced comfort, and sleep came only when exhaustion finally conquered fear. These enforcers walked without shame, but their footsteps left trails of pain. In every town square, there stood a post, wooden, stained, splintered by years of use. The whipping post. Here, punishment wasn't private, it was spectacle. The child who stole bread, the beggar who refused to move, the woman who wept too loudly. They were tied by the wrists, shirts torn, backs bared, and beaten in front of neighbours, in front of kin, in front of God. Each strike was meant not just to wound, but to shame. And the children? They screamed, their legs kicked, their faces twisted, and still the whip fell, because mercy was not part of the law, only order, only obedience. The beggar whipper stood beside them, sometimes smiling, sometimes drunk, sometimes dead inside. He had no need to justify his cruelty, the law had already done it for him. But these men, for all their power, were not honoured. They were feared, loathed. No one welcomed them into their home. No child looked up to them. They drank in corners, often alone. Many were violent even off duty, beating their wives, terrorising inns. Their tempers were short, their pockets rarely full. Some wore patched uniforms, others dressed as common thugs, but all carried the same aura. Avoid him, do not meet his eye, do not cross his path, because if you did, you might find yourself shackled, your child gone, your name erased, and your future sealed behind stone walls, beneath the whip and under the gaze of men paid to keep you low. We often say children are innocent, pure, free. But in the medieval world, childhood was not protection, it was not gentle. In fact, for many, it was the beginning of suffering. Because if you think the jobs we've explored so far were cruel, wait until you see what labour awaited the smallest hands and the softest hearts. They were small, light, quick with their fingers, and quiet, the perfect labourers, not by skill, but by size, and in a world where value was measured in what you could carry, clean or survive, children were cheap. They were not raised, they were used. Many were orphans, their parents lost to plague, war or poverty, no inheritance, no guardian, just a name, if they were lucky, and a pair of hands. They were swept into kitchens, to peel turnips until their knuckles bled, to wash pots scalding with fat, to carry firewood twice their size. In stables, they mucked out horse dung, brushed hides while dodging kicks, slept in hay beside lice-ridden dogs. In mines, they crawled into tunnels too tight for grown men, lanterns dangling from their necks, chiselling stone with fingers that should have held toys. And if they faltered, if they spilled, slipped, or spoke too loudly, they were beaten, not as punishment, but as training. Leather straps, closed fists, or the back of a wooden spoon still warm from boiling stew. It taught them obedience, it taught them silence, and worst of all, it taught them to see labour as their only worth. Others were called apprentices, a word that sounds like promise, like guidance, but for many, it was little more than slavery in ink. Their parents, desperate, signed them away to a tradesman, a blacksmith, a tailor, a baker. Teach him a trade, they begged, and the tradesman nodded. But he taught with fire and hunger and bruises. 7-year terms, sometimes 10, with no right to leave, no wage, no voice, only chores, only silence. They were children, but only in name. Of all the cruel uses for small bodies, perhaps none were darker or blacker than the chimney climb. Chimney sweeps were often boys, tiny, 5 years old, 6, sometimes younger. Their master would feed them little, just enough to keep them thin enough to fit into the flues, those narrow, sooty passageways cut through stone walls and roofs. They would be sent up with brush in hand to scrape the soot from inside. If they got stuck, they were told to wiggle, to cry softly so as not to disturb the house. Some fell, some suffocated. The soot filled their mouths, their eyes, their lungs. Many developed permanent coughs. Some lived to see their teens, bent, wheezing, blackened from within, and those who emerged, burned knees, ragged skin, bloodied elbows, and the praise, faster next time. They slept on soot sacks, or beside hearths still warm. They rarely bathed, they always coughed, and still they were needed, because clean chimneys meant safe fires, and safe fires meant noble comfort. So these little children were the cost of warmth. For many in medieval Europe, childhood did not exist, at least not as we understand it. There were no toys, no school books, no story hours or painted nurseries. There was only utility. Can you carry a bucket? Can you scrub a pot? Can you walk behind a cart? Then you can work. And if you can work, then you must. Even laughter was a kind of rebellion, play, a waste of time. A child who smiled too often was seen as idle, lazy, unworthy of bread, so they learned to swallow their joy, to replace it with obedience, to grow up too fast. Some never grew up at all. And still, not all suffering belonged to the labouring poor. Even those in silk could not always escape pain, because in the high towers and quiet chambers of nobility, some women lived lives just as bound and just as broken. In the noble house, when a lady of rank gave birth, she did not feed the child herself. That duty fell to the wet nurse, a peasant woman, chosen not for her mind, not for her warmth, but for one reason only, her milk. She had just given birth herself, and so she was hired, or more often, taken, to live within the household, to nurse the noble infant day and night until the child no longer needed her. And her own baby, left behind, to a neighbour, to a sister, to no one at all. Some wet nurses lost their children to neglect while nursing another's child into health. She was not embraced, she was not praised, she was a milk slave, a body with the function, her breast used, her voice unheard. When her milk dried, she was dismissed. No pension, no gift, no name remembered. The noble child grew strong. The wet nurse returned home, emptied in more ways than one. Other women took to the river banks. the laundresses, they worked before dawn, sometimes barefoot, sometimes knee-deep in freezing water while frost curled along the banks. They carried sacks of noble linens, soaked in blood, excrement, urine, mucus, sweat, shirts thick with lice, undergarments stiff with filth. Sheets from birthing rooms, or deathbeds. There were no gloves, no soap as we know it, only lye, ash water, boiled roots. They beat the clothes on rocks, rinsed them with buckets, hung them on lines beside steaming dung piles to dry. Their hands cracked, knuckles bled, fingernails broke until there was nothing left, and the water, always cold, even in spring, even in summer, their skin puckered, their joints stiffened, their backs bent, before they were 30, and still they worked, because without them, even the finest lady would stink. In the kitchens of manors and castles, beneath the cooks and the stewards, was the scullery maid. She was the youngest, the lowest, the first to rise, the last to sleep. Her world was grease and bone and broken bowls. She scrubbed the soot from pots, peeled turnips until her fingers blistered, carried water, stacked wood, plucked chickens, scrubbed floors on her knees. The cook snapped at her. The other staff mocked her. The masters ignored her. Sometimes the master noticed, and that was worse. Scullery maids were often abused, not just with words, but with hands, with whispers in the dark, with footsteps down the servant's stair. She could not say no, she could not speak at all, and if she wept, she was called lazy and beaten, but the next morning she was still there, still peeling, still scrubbing, still silent, because the scullery didn't clean itself. They were the invisible hands, the bent backs, the quiet endurance behind noble ease. And yet, for all their toil, they were still not the lowest in the social ladder, because below labour, beneath pain and hunger and filth, was nothing, no work, no coin, no worth, and those who lived with no job at all, treated worse than beasts. And they say work is hard, and it is, but in the medieval world, not working could be even worse, because for many, life without labour was not a rest, not a reprieve, but a sentence, and for some, the work they were born into was so total, so binding, that even death felt freer. Across the green hills of Europe, nestled in villages too small to mark on any map, lived the serfs. They were not slaves, not exactly, but neither were they free. They were bound to land, to lords, to a life that began in soil and ended there. From before sunrise until the stars began to blink, they worked, ploughing fields not for themselves, but for a master they rarely saw, tending crops they would never taste, repairing roads they were not allowed to travel. They paid rent in grain, in chickens, in time. They owed their labour to the Lord, planting his barley, harvesting his oats, mending his fences, and in return they were allowed not to starve, maybe. They could not leave, could not marry without permission, could not pass on freedom to their children. They were not prisoners. But there were no doors to open, only the endless turning of seasons, and the hope that the frost would not come too soon, that the rain would fall just enough, that the rats would not eat the grain before they did. And when it all failed, they had nothing. Famine was not rare. It came with the wind, with failed harvests, with war. Crops died, animals sickened, bread disappeared, and serfs, who already owned so little, found themselves eating roots, grass, sometimes clay, just to fill the belly. Children wasted away, mothers buried more than they birthed, and the field lay waiting, because tomorrow still required labour, even if the body trembled from hunger. Disease followed famine, weakened bodies, opened the door to fevers, to coughs, to pustules. War followed disease, or led it, and armies, whether friend or foe, took grain, took livestock, took the daughters, and the serfs they endured, not because they were strong, but because they had no choice. And yet, even this miserable existence was more than some had, because those with no land, no lord, no title, no master, were considered nothing. The jobless were feared, despised, suspected of idleness, of theft, of sin. There were no shelters, no handouts, no laws to protect them, only punishments. They were chased from towns, beaten by guards, hung for petty crimes, or forced into servitude. Some became outlaws, living in the forests, eating what they could steal, dying from infection or blade or winter. Others simply lay down one day and did not rise. There were no markers, no mourners, only the wind. In medieval Europe, work did not mean dignity, but to live without it meant death. And so the people kept labouring in filth, in pain, in silence. And as we look back, across all the jobs, from the blood-slick scaffold, to the soot-choked chimney, to the leech-filled swamp, to the child's blistered palm, we realise something hard, that the line between worker and slave was often invisible. So here we are. We've walked through blood, through soot, through filth, through silence. We've climbed into chimneys with children, kneeled at plague pits with trembling hands, listened for screams behind dungeon walls, watched as men lowered themselves into mines they might never leave. We have seen what work truly meant in the medieval world. And it wasn't glory, it wasn't purpose, it wasn't progress, it was survival. These jobs, these brutal, bone-wearing tasks, were never recorded in the royal scrolls, never praised in sermons, never carved into marble. But they were the bones of medieval society. They fed the cities, cleaned the streets, built the walls, buried the dead. Every kingdom that rose did so on their shoulders, not just the hands that built the cathedrals, but the ones that scraped the chamber pots beneath them, not just the architects of castles, but the tanners who soaked hides in filth to make shoes for the masons. These people, these labourers, were never remembered, and still the world continued because of them. And now, centuries later, you and I live in different clothes, under different stars, surrounded by machines and light and comfort. But if we look closely, those jobs never disappeared. They changed shape, changed tools, changed names. The gong farmer is now a sanitation worker, the charnel cleaner, a mortician, the rat catcher, a pest control technician, the dung farmer, a garbage collector, rising before dawn to lift the weight no one else wants to touch. And still, they are whispered about, rarely seen, rarely thanked. We do not write stories for them. We do not pause when they pass, but perhaps we should. Because in every age, there are those who toil unseen, who carry the weight of comfort for others, who bleed, bend and break quietly. They are not looking for praise, only to be seen, to be remembered. So tonight, as you rest your head on clean sheets, in a room warmed by the work of others, spare a thought for the forgotten labourer, for the silent worker, for the hands that carried us here, and let this story, whispered in the dark, be our way of saying, we remember you, we see you, we thank you,